We have a significant update to discuss today. For 15 years, clinicians have been relying on guidelines from 2010 for urinary tract infections.
Well, the burden of the disease is just massive. To understand the urgency, we really have to quantify this.
Sorry.
In 2021 alone, global statistics showed over 404 million cases of urinary tract infections.
404 million. Wow. And what about mortality?
Those cases led to 236,790 deaths.
So today we are analyzing the July 2025 Infectious Diseases Society of America guidelines for complicated urinary tract infections. What's the core mission here?
The mission is really a paradigm shift. We're moving away from these old, frankly outdated, complicated labels.
Towards what?
Towards a new framework that's based on the clinical reality of a modern aging population.
All right, let's start with Section 1. Reclassifying male patients. This feels like maybe the most significant change. How do the guidelines look at biological sex now?
This is a major update. Being male is no longer an automatic complication.
I want to be really clear on this because for decades, any urinary tract infection in a man was just labeled complicated, period.
Correct. The teaching was that male anatomy just made any infection complex by default.
And what did that label usually lead to?
That label often triggered really intensive workups, imaging that wasn't needed, urology consults, and most importantly, these prolonged antibiotic courses, 10 to 14 days.
That is no longer the standard.
It is not.
So what is the new definition of an uncomplicated urinary tract infection?
Under this 2025 framework, it's pretty simple. An uncomplicated urinary tract infection is an infection that's confined to the bladder in a patient who is a febrile.
And that definition applies to everyone.
It applies regardless of biological sex.
So just to spell it out, a male patient can have uncomplicated cystitis.
Yes, absolutely. If the infection is just in the lower tract, it's cystitis, and both men and women can have it.
That changes the workflow immediately. But we need to make a distinction here. What about a condition like prostatitis?
No, the presence of prostatitis still classifies an infection as complicated.
And why is that distinction still there?
Because with prostatitis, the infection extends beyond the bladder. It's actually in the tissue of the prostate gland.
So does this document tell us how to treat prostatitis?
It does not. The management of bacterial prostatitis, epididymitis, and orchitis is outside the scope of this specific document.
So clinicians need to look elsewhere for those protocols.
That's right.
The introduction also has a note on terminology about sex and gender. Can you clarify that for us?
Of course. The guidelines use male and female based on binary biological characteristics assigned at birth.
What's the reasoning they give for that?
They state that anatomy is what drives the risk. So those anatomical differences are the key factors here.
And do they address transgender patients?
They do acknowledge a lack of data specifically for transgender persons. They actually flag this as an area for future research.
Okay, let's move to Section 2, defining complicated. How do we distinguish between simple and complicated cases now?
The whole focus has shifted. It's moved from who the patient is to where the infection is.
That's a really critical distinction. So let's talk patient history. What about a patient with diabetes?
Diabetes does not automatically classify the case as a complicated urinary tract infection.
That's a big change from common practice. Okay, what about a patient who's immunocompromised?
Same thing. Immunocompromised does not automatically make it complicated.
Or urologic abnormalities like, say, benign prostatic hyperplasia?
Nope. Benign prostatic hyperplasia does not automatically classify it as a complicated urinary tract infection.
So a patient could have diabetes, be immunocompromised, and have benign prostatic hyperplasia, and you could still treat them as uncomplicated.
Yes, as long as one condition is met.
And what's that condition?
The patient must be a febrile, and the infection has to be confined to the bladder.
So if history doesn't define it, what criteria do define a complicated urinary tract infection right there at the point of care?
There are 4 defining categories, nice and clear.
Okay, let's list them. What's the first one?
Systemic signs. So this includes fever, chills, rigors, or any kind of hemodynamic instability.
So if I see a fever, it's complicated. Simple as that.
Yes.
What's the second category?
Anatomical extension. This would present as flank pain or costovertebral angle tenderness.
Got it. Flank pain, it's complicated.
Correct.
What's number 3?
Associated conditions. This would be something like bacteremia or the presence of a prostatic abscess.
So if the blood culture comes back positive, it's complicated.
Yes.
And the fourth category?
Foreign bodies. This means indwelling catheters, stents, or nephrostomy tubes.
If there's a tube, it's complicated.
Exactly.
This structure really helps clinicians prioritize physical exam findings over a deep dive into medical history, especially in a busy setting.
It does. It focuses you on localized versus systemic symptoms. It just simplifies the decision tree at the bedside.
Okay, let's talk section 3, treatment duration. How do these new definitions affect how long we treat with antibiotics?
Well, there's a very strong move towards shorter antibiotic courses.
We mentioned that old 10 to 14-day standard. What's the thinking on that now?
That standard is really being challenged by a lack of data. There's just no robust evidence that these comorbid populations actually benefit from longer therapy.
So those extra days of medication probably weren't providing extra benefit.
No, they were likely just increasing the risk of adverse events and, of course, antibiotic resistance.
So what are the specific recommended durations now for patients who are getting better clinically? Let's start with fluoroquinolones.
For fluoroquinolones, the recommendation is 5 to 7 days.
5 to 7 days.
Okay.
And for non-fluoroquinolone agents?
The recommendation is 7 days.
That's a clear standard, 7 days. But are there exceptions to this shorter course?
Yes, absolutely. High-risk groups were excluded from the short course trials, so we can't apply this data to them.
And who falls into these high-risk groups?
Patients with severe sepsis, patients with indwelling catheters, patients with abscesses, and patients with chronic kidney disease.
So what's the recommendation for them?
For these patients, they may still require traditional, longer therapy. Clinical judgment is still so important for these specific groups.
Let's move to section 4, which is about clinical cure versus microbiologic cure. What should the goal of treatment be?
The guidelines prioritize clinical cure over microbiologic cure. This is a big mental shift for a lot of us.
Can you define clinical cure for us?
Clinical cure is just the resolution of the patient's symptoms. The patient feels better, the dysuria is gone, the frequency is gone.
And microbiologic cure?
Microbiologic cure is a negative urine culture, so the bacteria are completely gone from the urine.
So in practice, how does this prioritization work?
It means you should not treat a positive culture if the patient feels fine. If the symptoms resolve, the episode is considered treated.
Even if there are still some bacteria in the urine?
Even if there are.
So does this mean we should stop doing test of cure cultures?
Yes. The guidelines specifically warn against doing test of cure cultures.
And why is that warning so explicit?
Because it prevents the overtreatment of asymptomatic bacteriuria.
Can you explain the risk of treating that?
Overtreatment drives resistance. You're exposing the patient to antibiotics without any clinical benefit, and you're just selecting for more dangerous organisms down the line.
That leads us right into section 5, resistance and empiric therapy. What are the current resistance thresholds the document mentions?
The data is pretty concerning. Resistance among Enterobacterales has really hit critical levels.
We're talking mostly about Escherichia coli here.
Yes, Escherichia coli is the main pathogen, and resistance has crossed the 20% threshold for our common oral drugs.
Which drugs specifically have crossed that 20% line?
Trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, and nitrofurantoin.
20%.
Yeah.
So that means 1 in 5 prescriptions could fail if you just prescribe it empirically.
That's exactly right.
And what about fluoroquinolone resistance?
Fluoroquinolone resistance in pyelonephritis is frequently over 10%.
So given these numbers, how are we supposed to select a medication?
The guidelines outline a really helpful 4-step approach.
Okay, let's walk through those 4 steps. What's step 1?
Assess severity. First thing, you have to look for sepsis or shock.
And why is that number 1?
Because if sepsis or shock is present, oral therapy is completely off the table. You need immediate intravenous broad-spectrum coverage.
Makes sense. What's step 2?
Evaluate risk factors. You need to check for multi-drug-resistant organisms.
What are we looking for there?
Things like recent antibiotic use, a history of infections with resistant bugs, or recent travel history.
Okay. Step 3.
Review patient factors. So this is your classic allergies, prior antibiotic exposures, that sort of thing.
And finally, step 4.
Check the local antibiogram.
Why is the local antibiogram so important?
Because national averages don't reflect what's happening in your specific hospital or community. Resistance patterns can vary by zip code. You have to pick the right drug for your location.
Let's get specific on the agents. For a patient who is very sick with sepsis or shock, what are the recommendations?
You should be using third or fourth generation cephalosporins, carbapenems, or piperacillin-tazobactam.
Okay, can you specify which cephalosporins?
Specifically ceftriaxone or cefepime.
And the carbapenems.
Specifically meropenem or ertapenem.
And the penicillin combination.
Piperacillin-tazobactam.
So these are all intravenous agents for very sick patients.
That's right.
What about a patient without sepsis who can take oral treatment?
In that case, fluoroquinolones or trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole are options.
But is that an automatic choice?
No, absolutely not. It's completely contingent on your local resistance patterns from that antibiogram.
So if local resistance to, say, trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole is high, what does the clinician do?
Then they should choose an alternative agent. Or, if the patient is stable, wait for the culture results to come back.
We've covered a lot here. Demographics, definitions, durations, drugs. This is a very comprehensive update.
It really is.
So let's summarize. What's the real intent behind all these changes?
I think the guidelines are trying to modernize management for the population we actually see now, an aging population. And they do that by using a simplified, symptom-based classification system.
So it simplifies the decision process.
It does. It removes a lot of the guesswork that was tied to these complicated labels that were based only on history.
And it's important to remember the nature of this document, right?
Yes. These guidelines are a voluntary educational service.
What does that mean for the provider on the ground?
It means they're designed to support your clinical judgment, not replace it. The provider at the bedside still has to evaluate the individual patient in front of them.